Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 20 and 21. So let's begin. The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling, Chapters 20 and 21. Dear Okeko, I hope you are going well. Have you spoken to Kazu recently? Dad says that since we moved her dad might let her talk to you. I'm jealous. Say hello for me. To Minato as well please. Who have you got as your homeroom teacher? Did you get Mr. Yoshida or Miss Hirano? I got Miss Samai. She's kind of like Miss Kushi. She dismisses the quirkless. Why do people do that? I haven't been able to make friends with anyone in my class. They have all formed their own groups. No one talks to me. Don't worry. I'm not alone. I have made friends with someone in 4th year. Her name is Himiko Toga. I think you'd get along well with her. The rest of my class is horrible. They keep taking my bento, or bag, or pencils, and sometimes all three. The bag comes back. I have a cheap one but I think Kurogiri is getting tired of replacing bento boxes. Thankfully no one takes things out of my shoe locker so I've been able to keep lunch tokens in there. They are so mean. I don't know what I've done wrong. Kurogiri hasn't said anything and Tomura just laughs. I miss you, so much. Izuku looked at the letter and then he screwed it up. He couldn't tell Okeko that. She'd worry. He took out another piece of paper. Kurogiri had gotten him some writing paper when he said he wanted to send letters to his friends, since he couldn't text them. Okeko didn't have a phone and it wasn't fair to just send the message to Minato and expect him to pass it on. Izuku knew he would, but it would be better if he gave them both the same message. He started again. Dear Okeko, I hope you are doing well. Summer was so boring. Tomura played games all summer and I wrote in my notebook, but believe it or not, even that gets boring. Who did you get as your homeroom teacher? Mr. Yoshida or Miss Hirano? My teacher is called Miss Samai. She's okay and has been able to help out in science a bit, so she's better than Miss Kushi that way. I know Miss Kushi was our first year teacher, but I like science, you know that. Have you spoken to Kazu recently? Dad said that since I moved, her dad might let her talk to you again. I'm jealous. If so, say hello for me. I'm sending a letter to Minato, so you don't need to say hello to him. How much weight can you lift now? I can now project my fire breath 2 meters. He looked at the letter. It was a bit shorter but definitely safer. Izuku added a few smiley faces and signed off before he folded the paper and put it in an envelope. Kurogiri had the address and had already said he'd post it. Izuku pulled out one of his quirk notebooks. It was the one he'd started this year on the quirks of his new classmates. They might be mean and liars, but their quirks were interesting. Zakuro's quirk was to change other people's hair and eye color. That was so useful. He could be so helpful in generating disguises for others. Though Izuku hadn't been able to figure out if Zakuro actually changed the hair and eye color or simply changed other people's perception of them. He desperately wanted to ask, but he knew Zakuro would run a mile from him if he did. Mawari's quirk allowed her to recognize any smell, and he thought she had great taste buds as well if her bentos were anything to go by. He wasn't sure, and she hadn't answered any questions, but the bentos she brought were filled with an assortment of very yummy-looking things. Yusei's quirk allowed her to mimic any animal's cry. She could literally sing like a songbird. Izuku didn't know if she could use that ability to talk to animals. They were saying things when they made noise after all, even if it was only to confirm that the tree was theirs, but how cool would it be to know what they were proclaiming and to be able to talk back? Himiko's quirk allowed her to. Izuku frowned, turning the pages past his classmates to his friend. There was a simple sketch of her on the page. This time with her hair up properly in messy buns. But he didn't know what her quirk did. She'd never told him and he'd never seen a reason to press. She knew he was quirkless and didn't seem to care, so maybe he could ask? Wait, no, if he was going to ask, then he should take her lunch. Something rare. Izuku jumped up. He had to give the letter to Kurogiri anyway, but while he was at it, he'd ask for something for Himiko. That would put her into a good mood and maybe she'd tell him. Izuku smiled, glancing at the page. It would be good to get that information. My quirk? Himiko asked, looking up from lovingly licking at the rare beef Izuku had presented her with. It was cold today, even in the classrooms, so it had remained fresh in the bento. There was the threat of rain later, so Izuku had his umbrella with him as well. If he left it in the classroom, it would no doubt be borrowed. It wasn't borrowing if he never got it back. He didn't know how Miss Samae didn't understand that. You know I'm quirkless, Izuku said, but I was wondering about yours. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, he added quickly, looking over at her with bright green eyes, silently reassuring his friend that she didn't have to say if she didn't want to. My quirk's called transform, Himiko shrugged. It's a nasty quirk. That cry came from one of the others in Himiko's classroom. They were eating lunch there, though Izuku had brought his bag. Since it was nearly winter, a lot of the students were inside. Though a fair number had gone to the cafeteria. Some, he could see from the window, were braving the outside, but the number was getting less and less each day. That's why there were always people around to overhear conversations. Himiko didn't even flinch at the comment. She did seem angry though. What does it let you transform into? Izuku asked, ignoring the speaker. Transform sounded useful. His friend gave him a look. Her buns were very messy today and almost looked like they weren't there with the amount of hair spilling out from them, but he could see the elastic holding them in place. Anyone, Himiko answered softly. Anyone? Izuku's eyes went wide. She nodded. That's fantastic. He cried. You could do so much as a quirkless moron. Whoever had spoken before laughed. This time Izuku couldn't help but look. Transform is a wonderful quirk, he said to those still in the classroom. Not when it's blood triggered. He didn't catch who replied. For a moment Izuku was speechless, then he turned back to Himiko. So the blood forms a template? He asked. He'd heard Dr. Garaki use the word. She looked surprised, but nodded. That's amazing. Can you transform into anyone? Into anything? How small can you go? How large can you go? What are the limits? Does the amount of blood matter? How long can you hold the transformation? Does it hurt? Is it difficult to walk on 4 legs? Where do your clothes go? Can you transform into a bird? He rapidly fired the questions at her, desperately wanting to pull out a notebook he'd left at home today. He'd have to settle for writing notes in one of his class books. Oh my god, quirkless really is a moron. Izuku ignored that, looking towards Himiko. That's why you like rare beef. He laughed. Himiko looked at him. He could see that her yellow eyes were confused. I need human blood to transform, she told him. Oh, Izuku said, momentarily taken back. Oh, he said again, more understanding this time. That's incredible. That's the best quirk for hero work. He exclaimed. Izuku could feel the weight of the stares on him from Himiko's classmates. He could see her eyes on him. You could do so much with it. You're not serious, quirkless? Of course I am. Izuku responded without thought. Infiltration would be so easy. Do you get the abilities of those you transform into? If so, then wow. That would be awesome and you could do so much. I don't want to be a hero, Himiko told him. Izuku waved one hand to dismiss that statement. There's still so much you could do with it, he gushed. You're athletic. You could be a stunt double for actors and actresses. You could do detective work because you could look like anyone. There's so many options and limited quirk licenses are easy enough to get. Especially for stunt work. If Himiko went that way, the studios would probably put a rush on the application. His green eyes shone and Izuku couldn't help the smile that split his features. This was so exciting. I need blood, Izuku, Himiko reminded him. That's not a problem, Izuku dismissed it. While Kurogiri tried to keep him out of the bar, he heard plenty from those who came in early. He was usually asleep by the time the later customers came in. And he'd spoken to Giran and Juhin often enough to know they could get anything. Not a problem? One of the other kids howled in laughter. Izuku shrugged. It wasn't really a problem. If people knew what your quirk did, then accommodations were made all the time. His dad had told him how much had changed in the world since quirks came about. Tailoring, which used to be only for the super rich, was now a much respected profession with the number of mutations that had to be accommodated for. While most people had 2 arms, 2 legs and a head, the number of body shapes had exploded. Tails, claws, horns, everything was possible now. So most clothing retailers offered a customization service to go with the sale. Even diets had changed. And there were allowances for that. Maybe not at every restaurant, but there were those that catered for people with some of the more unusual requirements. Where before, humans had been generalists, now they were specialists in every niche. You just had to find the right human. So if Himiko needed blood, then that wasn't going to be a problem. She was looking at him oddly, as if seeing him for the first time. Himiko gave him a shy smile. You know, for someone quirkless, you have a lot of ideas, she told him softly. I like quirks, he told her. I study them. Himiko nodded. I like you, Izu. Izu? The smile shifted to something more proud. You're my friend, she announced. Izuku couldn't help the grin he gave her, and the warm feeling Himiko's statement gave him carried him back to his classroom and all the way through to the final bell. Which is when he should have known that things would start going wrong again. He packed his bag and waited for the rest of his class to leave. That was for the best. He either had to rush out to beat them all, or wait for them all to go. That way he didn't get tripped. It wasn't that bad. His class was eager to get home, and it was only a few minutes before he got up from his desk and went to the door. There were still people in the corridor, but that was okay. Izuku walked down to the school's entrance and went to his shoe locker. Izuku opened it and instantly felt the warm feeling he had from Himiko's words disappear. His shoes were gone. His lunch tokens were gone. He closed his eyes, leaning forward to rest his head on the locker lip as he took a deep breath. He should have known things were going too well. Izuku didn't bother to look around. Chances were whoever had taken his shoes would be watching, and he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing his reaction. He did surreptitiously look though. Sometimes, they would put his things in odd or embarrassing places, and he would like to have his shoes now. But they were nowhere. He closed the locker, wondering if he could get a small lock for it. While it wouldn't prevent someone determined, it would make it clear that they had broken in. Surely the teachers would notice that? Izuku picked up his bag and took a deep breath as he turned to the door. He still had his indoor shoes at least. Right on cue he heard a deep rumble, which was followed by a familiar pattern of rain. Perfect. At least he still had his umbrella. Izuku closed his eyes as he reached the door and pulled out his umbrella. It would at least keep most of him dry, but he knew, by the time he got back home, his feet were going to be soaked. He trudged out into the rain before someone could push him. Izuku walked, blinking against the tears that formed. Why were they being so mean? Why? It wasn't normal. He thought fondly of last year. Okeko and Minato would have shrieked in the rain and they all would have run. They would have been soaked, but it would have been fun. Walking home, alone, even with his umbrella, was not fun. Why had this happened to him? The rain didn't give Izuku any answers. Shut the fucking door. Izuku recognized Tomura's shout. The other boy needn't have bothered, he was shutting it as fast as he could. Inside was so much warmer than outside, and he needed all the warmth he could get. It was snowing outside and… Izuku, where is your coat? Kurogiri interrupted his internal thoughts. The green-haired boy looked down at the floor. The misty man sighed. He knew what had happened. Go and have a bath to warm up, he instructed, coming over to take Izuku's bag. Izuku sniffed and reached up to dash tears from his eyes. Every day this week, something of his had been stolen. And today he'd been tripped several times into the snow. The others claimed they were playing, but Izuku knew better. They weren't playing when he was cold, and wet and freezing. Not when he'd told them to stop. Not when the teachers knew he'd told them to stop. Go on, Kurogiri encouraged. I will replace your coat, he added. There was absolutely no accusation in his tone. It was a simple fact. That caused Izuku to cry. He didn't want Kurogiri to have to replace his coat. He didn't want Kurogiri to keep having to get bento boxes. He didn't want these things to happen. He didn't know why people were tripping him and stealing his stuff. The only difference was he, supposedly, had no quirk. It wasn't like he wasn't human. Or anything like that. But they continued to do it and the teachers did nothing. It wasn't his fault. The misty man watched his tears for a moment before he was enveloped in a hug. There, Izuku, there. It was odd to hear Kurogiri croon, but Izuku knew he was trying to comfort him. He swallowed his tears and tried to pull back. He was 7.5. He should be able to handle this. Kurogiri felt the moment. Go have a bath, and I will prepare some miso soup to help you warm up, he added. Izuku nodded as Kurogiri released him. He needed that bath. Izuku, where is your scarf and gloves? Kurogiri's voice sounded concerned as he handed Izuku his bento. It was cold outside and had snowed in the night. One did not venture out without appropriate clothing. The green-eyed boy paused in packing the bento into his bag and just looked at the floor. That response was answer enough. The bartender didn't sigh. He knew what it meant. He'd missed Izuku coming back last night. There'd been a delivery from Giran and he'd had to deal with that, which meant he'd missed the fact that Izuku no longer had his scarf and gloves. Instead, Kurogiri opened a warp gate and deposited a replacement scarf and gloves in front of Izuku. The gloves were a little large but would keep him warm. "Thank you," Izuku said, and then resumed packing his bento. "Do you? I don't want to talk about it." Izuku interrupted. Kurogiri nodded. He'd expected as much. Sensei had told him this was likely as well. He didn't understand what Sensei was doing, but he trusted the man even if it was hurting Izuku. There would be some lesson there. Izuku did up his bag and put on the scarf and gloves. He walked to the door to put on his outside shoes. "Kurogiri?" His voice questioned softly as the freckled boy paused at the door. "Yes, Izuku?" the misty man asked. "Why are people so mean?" That was not a question he was expecting, and in his moment of shock, Izuku slipped out. Kurogiri looked at the door for several long moments after the child had disappeared. It was not a question he was expected to answer either, but it was a question that hurt. Izuku heard the snort before he saw the other boy. He continued walking, being as careful as he could not to drip on the floor. He suspected he'd have to get the mop anyway. "Bwahaha!" Tomura laughed. Izuku could see his gold eyes were actually amused for once through the fingers of the hand that graced his face. He'd taken to wearing that one a lot lately. "Turn around," the older boy ordered. Izuku ignored him. "Oh come on. I want to see how thoroughly they got you," he added. Izuku didn't need to do that. He knew the answer already. He could feel mud even on his back, but he suspected someone had shoved some there. He kept walking. "You know, it is kinda impressive," Tomura said, "that little NPCs like that can do so much, especially since we're in a city, not a farm." The green-haired boy ignored him still. Since the fight before they moved here, Tomura had stayed away from Izuku, and Izuku had done him the same service. They saw each other occasionally. That was unavoidable living in the same space, but they didn't talk. No one had said anything to Izuku about that fight, but he suspected his dad had a long talk with Tomura about it. The boy had appeared chastised for a few weeks after it. And there'd been some times when he was sure Tomura was going to talk to him but didn't. Except now, when Izuku just wanted to get to the bathroom and strip off his clothes. Then he'd have to put them in the wash and somehow try to get them dry before tomorrow. And clean up the mud he was no doubt dropping onto the floor. "Where did they get the dirt from?" Tomura mocked. The boy laughed again. "All this, because you want to be a hero." "They don't want heroes," he continued. "They don't deserve heroes," he added. Right at the moment, with mud dripping coldly down his back, Izuku could almost see what Tomura meant. "How is school going, my little dragon?" All for One asked his son. He already knew the answer. Kurogiri kept him well informed, but his son was showing a rather pleasing degree of stubbornness. The fact that Izuku was still insisting that he wanted to be a hero, despite the mistreatment by his classmates, was annoying, but the determination was gratifying. Now all he had to do was harness that determination to his cause, and he was sure that with a few more pushes, Izuku would come to see things his way. He had with Inko after all. "It's going okay, Dad," Izuku replied. "That's good," Hisashi agreed blandly. His son might be 7, but he knew when he was being humored. "Do you have any stories to tell me? You used to regale me with stories all the time," he added the prompt. Izuku looked uncomfortable. All for One knew he didn't want to say anything about what was happening. "All the kids already had their friends," he said. "Are you lonely?" Green hair shook in the negative. "No, I talked to Himiko." "Oh, another lady," Hisashi teased. "Who is Himiko?" he asked. "She's in the grade above me," Izuku told him. "We eat lunch together and she likes blood." "Blood, really?" he asked. "It's for her quirk." Hisashi nodded. It wasn't as unusual as people made out, but there was a taboo on speaking about quirks that required something society was uncomfortable with. Those who now required carrion, for example, kept quiet about it, while butchers made the rotting meat available. It was like most things, where there was a demand. There would be a supply, even if society preferred to look the other way. He looked at Izuku. His son's head was down and his posture was screaming that he didn't want to discuss anything further. Except Hisashi had already given him most of the year without discussing it, so they were going to have at least a little conversation now. Izuku, he said softly. His son always knew he was serious when he used his name and now was no exception. Green eyes raised to look at him instead of the floor. Tell me, All for One said gently. He saw his son's lip tremble and tears welled up in his eyes before overflowing. Hisashi remained seated, waiting for Izuku to respond. His son sniffed, and continued crying silently but didn't speak. Stubborn again. I can't help you unless you tell me, Hisashi told his son. I don't need help, Izuku told him. They are only like this because they don't know. Don't know what? All for One asked. They don't know I have a quirk, Izuku explained. Hisashi could hear how weak the argument was to his son and was tempted not to reply because he knew Izuku would see how immoral it was, but he needed to press his advantage now. Stubbornness was acceptable but only when Izuku's goals aligned with his. Why does that make a difference? He asked. Izuku's lips trembled and Hisashi saw him flinch. It doesn't, he sobbed. All for One took a deep breath, allowing Izuku to hear it. Izuku, remember that children are more honest than adults. What they are doing to you openly now, they will learn to hide as they grow up. They will learn to hide that, and society will get to live with the mask of compassion. But strip away that pretense, as you do with children, and society isn't nice. His son didn't nod but remained still. Even so, All for One knew that Izuku had heard, and while, at 7, it was doubtful that his son could think of a logical argument against him, he would be able to feel one. The fact that he said nothing meant that he agreed. He just didn't want to admit it. Why? Izuku asked finally. Because people are cruel, Izuku. All for One repeated the statement he had told his son many times. Especially if you are different, if you are weak, people are cruel. It's just as they get older, they learn to get better at pretending otherwise. Heroes do not protect the weak, Izuku, they protect themselves. Hisashi moved on to the next part of his argument. Izuku looked up towards the ceiling and Hisashi saw his throat working. He was trying to fight back his tears but they were still falling. They learn, Izuku repeated his words. Hisashi hid a wince. He knew that tone. Izuku was about to become stubborn again. Well, he had more than one argument. It was just a matter of finding the right one. They learn, Izuku said it again, and All for One knew he was working something out in his head. Heroes strive to be better for society, he said. It was a naive view but Hisashi let it stand. It would be best to hear Izuku out before he offered any contradictory information. He had learned many, many things in his long life, and it was very true that no one ever changed their mind by losing an argument. Children were not exempt from this truth. My classmates are young. They can learn to be better, Izuku said as his tears cleared. They just need education. For a long moment Hisashi almost couldn't believe that was the argument his son made before he realized that to a 7-year-old who was as optimistic as his son tended to be, it would make sense. He clasped his hands in front of him and leaned forward. My little dragon, you see the best in people, he said, but I think you will find that society does not wish to learn. Izuku didn't glare at him but he could see that his son was now determined. He knew that look, and it pained him that his son would have to learn this the hard way. But sometimes, that was the only way to learn. Little dragon. School isn't the same without you. Even Kazu agrees with that. She says hello again and is sorry that she can't write to you herself. Miss Hirano is better than Miss Kushi but she's pregnant. She should be retiring at the end of the year. Mum finally let me help out with moving some supplies at their latest job. Concrete bags. She only let me move them one at a time though, but I tested myself when she wasn't looking. I could take 7 of them at once if I wanted to. I also picked up 11 of them at once, but that made me throw up. Mum sent me to the site office then. If she doesn't let me practice, I'm not going to be able to use my quirk properly. Dad gave me a lecture that night but they do need more help, so I'll be going to the site again this weekend and this time I should be moving the framing wood. I had to promise to only move 1 truss at a time. They're about 60 kilos each, so only half of what I can lift. I'll see if I can practice by carrying one, and leaving one levitating on the pile. I think if I only lifted a few centimeters Mum and Dad won't notice and I'll still get practice. How are you going with your fire? What shapes can you make now? It sounds so exciting and I want to see it. Especially the little animals. It will be so cool. Minato says his little sister's quirk has come in. He says little Ayame can change the length and color of her hair. He's also sure that she can control it a bit, but no one seems to believe him. Is asked for some suggestions on how to find out if she can? Write back with anything if you can. Missing you lots. Okeko. End chapters 20 and 21, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters. Please like and subscribe. And again, join me for the next chapters. Or check out Jade's other works.